You satisfies walk into your bank tomorrow morning. Same building, same teller, same smile. But when you ask to withdraw your savings, they tell you your dollars are worth 30% less than yesterday. Not because of a crash, not because of inflation, because overnight the world decided your currency is not worth what it used to be. Sounds impossible, right? Right now, as of December 2025, the U.S. national debt sits at $38.4 trillion. That number grows by 70,840 throws every single second. Not every minute, every second. And here is what nobody's talking about on the evening news. Russia and China just announced that 99.1% of their bilateral trade, $244.8 billion worth, now settles in rubles and yuan. Not a single dollar touches those transactions. 10 countries, representing over half the world's population, have joined a coalition actively building payment systems that bypass the dollar entirely. Meanwhile, America's response? Add another $4.1 trillion to the debt with the One Big Beautiful Bill Act and pretend nothing is happening. This is not speculation. This is not conspiracy. These are official numbers from the Congressional Budget Office, the World Gold Council, and the Russian Finance Ministry. What you're about to see is the pattern that has destroyed every reserve currency in history. And once you recognize it, you will understand exactly where America stands right now. Every reserve currency collapse in history follows the same four-stage pattern. Not similar, identical. I call it the reserve currency death spiral. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Stage 1 starts when a dominant economic power begins financing its supremacy through debt instead of productivity. Think of it like a credit card with no limit. You can buy whatever you want today, but the bill compounds in the shadows. Here is where America stands right now. At the end of fiscal year 2025, U.S. debt held by the public hit 100% of GDP. That means the government owes as much as the entire economy produces in a year. The Congressional Budget Office projects this will reach 118% by 2035 and 156% by 2055. But here's the number that should stop you cold. In fiscal year 2025, interest payments on the national debt crossed $1 trillion for the first time in American history. Not paying down the debt, just servicing it, just covering the interest. 5 years ago, in 2020, that number was $345 billion. It has nearly tripled. Interest is now the second largest expense in the federal budget, behind only Social Security. It has already passed Medicare. It has already passed national defense. You're now paying more to service past borrowing than to fund the entire U.S. military. The Congressional Budget Office projects interest costs will reach $1.8 trillion annually by 2035. At that point, roughly 22% of every tax dollar collected will go straight to bondholders. Not schools, not roads, not hospitals, bondholders, many of whom are foreign governments. And this is where Stage 2 begins, when rivals start noticing the cracks. Stage 2 is when rival powers start questioning the system. They do not revolt immediately. They probe, they test alternatives, they build escape routes while smiling at summit meetings. This is where we are right now. BRICS started as 5 countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. An acronym and not much else. As of January 2025, it has expanded to 10 full members. Egypt, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates have joined. Think about that list for a moment. Indonesia is the 4th most populous nation on Earth. The UAE controls some of the largest sovereign wealth funds in existence. Iran has been building sanctions-resistant financial infrastructure for decades. Together, BRICS members now represent over half the world's population and a growing share of global GDP. But membership is not the story. The story is what they are doing with that membership. In November 2025, Russian Finance Minister Anton Siluanov announced that 99.1% of Russia-China trade now settles in rubles and yuan. Before the Ukraine invasion in 2022, that number was under 2%. Let that timeline sink in. 3 years, from 2% to 99%. China-Russia bilateral trade hit a record $244.8 billion in 2024. Every tanker of oil, every shipment of machinery, every container of goods settled without a single dollar changing hands, and they are building the pipes to scale this globally. China's cross-border interbank payment system, known as CIPS, now connects 1,138 financial institutions across 127 countries. Compare that to SWIFT, which connects over 11,000 banks. CIPS is not bigger, but it does not need to be bigger. It just needs to be functional enough that getting cut off from SWIFT is no longer a death sentence. Russia learned that lesson in February 2022 when the West froze $300 billion in Russian foreign reserves and cut major banks from SWIFT. The stated goal was to collapse the Russian economy within weeks. The actual result? Every non-Western country watched and asked themselves one question: could they do this to us? The answer is yes. And that realization changed everything. According to the IMF, the dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves dropped from 71% in 2000 to roughly 59% in 2024. The Atlantic Council's data from November 2025 puts it at 56%. That is a 15 percentage point collapse in 25 years, with the decline accelerating after 2022. But central banks are not just moving out of dollars. They are moving into something specific: gold. From 2022 to 2024, central banks purchased 3,220 metric tons of gold. That is more than double what they bought in the 3 years prior. The World Gold Council confirms purchases exceeded 1,000 tons annually for 3 consecutive years. In the first half of 2025, Poland led all buyers with 67.2 tons. Azerbaijan added 34.5 tons. Kazakhstan added 22.1 tons. In total, 23 countries increased their gold reserves in just 6 months. Gold. Here's the detail that should alarm you. The World Gold Council surveyed 73 central banks in 2025. 95% expect global gold reserves to increase over the next 12 months. 43% plan to increase their own holdings. Not a single central bank surveyed expects their gold reserves to decline. That is not diversification, that is preparation. In July 2025, Egyptian Prime Minister Mustafa Madbouli confirmed that BRICS members are increasingly adopting local currency settlements as official policy. Russia and Iran now conduct over 95% of bilateral trade in rubles and reals. Brazil and China have agreements to bypass the dollar for their $100 billion annual trade relationship. And here's the response from Washington. President Trump threatened 100% tariffs on any BRICS nation that challenges dollar supremacy. Russia's response came from spokesman Dmitry Peskov. Quote, "If the U.S. uses economic force to compel countries to use the dollar, it will further strengthen the trend of switching to national currencies." America threatened economic war, and the other side said thank you for the motivation. Now let me show you why this pattern is not new. Let me show you exactly what happens when a reserve currency enters this spiral. November 1923, Berlin. A university professor walks into a cafe and orders a cup of coffee. The price is 5,000 marks. He drinks it slowly, reading his newspaper. 15 minutes later, he orders a second cup. Same cafe, same coffee. New price, 7,000 marks. This was not a movie. This was not fiction. This was daily life in Weimar Germany during the most catastrophic hyperinflation in modern history. Before World War I, the German mark was one of the most trusted currencies on earth, and the exchange rate stood at 4.2 marks to $1 US. Stable, respected. Backed by gold. By November 1923, that same dollar bought 4.2 trillion marks. Let me say that again so it registers. 4.2 marks became 4.2 trillion marks in less than a decade. Here is the detail most people miss. It was not the war that destroyed the mark. It was the response to the debt. Germany ended World War I owing 156 billion marks in war debt. The Treaty of Versailles added another 50 billion in reparations. And here is the critical part. Those reparations had to be paid in gold-backed currency, not paper. Faced with this impossible burden, the government made a choice that sealed its fate. Instead of raising taxes and facing public anger, they chose the printing press. Starting in August 1921, the Reichsbank began buying foreign currency with marks at any price, no limits, no restraint. The stated reason was to pay reparations in hard currency. The actual reason, revealed in Reichschancellery records examined by British economists after the crisis, was to deliberately destroy the currency and escape the debt obligations. Think about what that means. A central bank intentionally sabotaging its own currency, choosing controlled demolition over fiscal discipline. The results came fast. Prices doubled every 3.7 days at the peak. Workers demanded to be paid twice daily because their morning wages could not buy lunch by afternoon. Pensioners who had saved their entire lives watched those savings become worthless in a matter of weeks. A pound of bread that cost 250 marks in January 1923 cost 200 billion marks by November. People burned currency for heat because it was cheaper than buying firewood. A wheelbarrow full of cash could not buy a loaf of bread, but the wheelbarrow itself had value. Here is what the textbooks leave out. The hyperinflation was not an accident. It was not incompetence. British and French economic experts who examined German records after the crisis concluded the government engineered the collapse. It was economic warfare against its own citizens, disguised as mismanagement. And the social cost? Law and order collapsed. Food riots spread through major cities. Political extremism moved from the fringe to the mainstream as people lost faith in democratic institutions. The currency stabilized in 1924 only because America stepped in with the Dawes Plan and gold-backed loans. The mark was replaced with the Rentenmark. Banks turned worthless currency over to junk dealers by the ton to be recycled as scrap paper. But stabilization did not undo the damage. The middle class had been wiped out. A generation of savers learned that trusting the government with your wealth meant losing everything. The chaos created the perfect breeding ground for extremist movements. Adolf Hitler's rise to power a decade later grew directly from the soil of that monetary catastrophe. And here is the part that echoes into the present. Even today, over a century later, Germans remain deeply fearful of inflation. The Bundesbank built its entire institutional identity around preventing a repeat. German politicians treat deficit spending as almost immoral. The trauma never left. The cultural memory of watching money lose meaning in real time shaped an entire nation's relationship with currency for generations. Now you might think Germany was unique, a defeated nation, a punitive peace treaty, exceptional circumstances. So let me show you what happened to the most powerful empire in human history when its currency entered the same spiral. For 3 centuries, the British pound was the undisputed king of global finance. At its peak in the late 1800s, sterling settled nearly 60% of all international trade. The word itself became synonymous with reliability. When people said something was pound sterling, they meant it was as trustworthy as British money. Nations held pounds the way countries hold dollars today, unshakable, permanent. The foundation of global commerce. Then came the cracks. World War II did not just drain Britain's treasury, it shattered the illusion of invincibility. By 1945, Britain owed the United States $4.3 billion in today's money, roughly $80 billion. Another $3.5 billion was owed to Canada. The empire that once ruled a quarter of the world's landmass was functionally bankrupt. But here is the moment most historians gloss over. The moment the pound truly died. July 15th, 1947. Britain had negotiated a massive loan from America to stay afloat. One condition was attached: make the pound convertible to dollars. Seems reasonable. A show of confidence, a return to normalcy. On that date, they did exactly that. Within 5 weeks, Britain hemorrhaged over $1 billion in foreign reserves. 5 weeks. Foreign holders of pounds saw their chance and took it. They rushed to convert to dollars, sensing weakness in the system. The British government, humiliated and desperate, suspended convertibility on August 20th, 1947. The damage was done. The world had seen the truth. The pound could not hold its value without capital controls. The emperor had no clothes. What followed was 3 decades of managed decline. Currency crisis in 1949, devaluation. Currency crisis in 1967, devaluation. Currency crisis in 1976, collapse. Each time, Britain tried to maintain the pound's international role while the economic fundamentals screamed otherwise. Each time, the gap between perception and reality grew wider. Here is the hidden detail that should reframe everything you think about currency competition. American policymakers actively encouraged the pound's decline. This was not neutral observation. The Federal Reserve and U.S. Treasury were strategic beneficiaries of every British crisis. Declassified documents from the National Archives show U.S. officials privately celebrating each sterling devaluation as an opportunity to expand dollar hegemony. Every percentage point the pound lost in global reserves was a percentage point the dollar gained. By 1976, Britain reached bottom. The government went to the International Monetary Fund for a bailout. This was the first time a developed Western economy had to beg for emergency funds since World War II. The terms were humiliating: spending cuts, policy conditions, public acknowledgement of failure. The pound's share of global reserves, which had been 60% in 1950, collapsed to under 3% by 1980. A reserve currency that had dominated for 3 centuries became a regional afterthought in 30 years. But the economic numbers do not capture what actually happened. The psychological transformation was total. Britain went from an empire that controlled territories on every continent to a mid-tier economy that could not guarantee the value of its own currency. The pound's collapse did not just change exchange rates, it changed British identity. A nation that had defined itself by global financial leadership had to learn what it meant to be ordinary, to be dependent, to ask permission from institutions it once would have dismissed. And here is the lesson that matters for today. The pound's decline was not a sudden event. It was a process. A long, slow erosion that looked manageable at every individual moment. In 1945, experts said Britain was too important to fail. In 1947, they said the convertibility crisis was a temporary setback. In 1967, they said devaluation would restore competitiveness. In 1976, they said the IMF bailout was a fresh start. At no point did the consensus acknowledge what was actually happening. A reserve currency was dying in slow motion while everyone insisted it was just a rough patch. Dominance does not end with a single dramatic collapse. It ends with a series of manageable crises, each one slightly worse than the last, until one day you look up and realize the world has moved on. Now, you might think these examples are from a different era, pre-digital, pre-globalized, ancient history. So let me show you what happened when a nuclear superpower watched its currency collapse. In living memory. December 1991, Moscow. Citizens stand in line for hours to buy bread. They clutch rubles that lose value while they wait. Store shelves sit empty. The temperature hovers below freezing, but people do not leave the queue. If they leave, they do not eat. The Soviet Union, a nuclear superpower with the largest military in Europe and global influence spanning continents, is weeks away from total collapse. The official story you learned in school? Communism failed. The real story? Currency failure destroyed state legitimacy. In the 1970s, the Soviet ruble functioned as the dominant currency across 15 republics and dozens of satellite states. It settled trade throughout the entire Eastern Bloc. And while never a global reserve currency like the dollar, within its sphere, the ruble was king. The foundation of the collapse was laid years before anyone saw the cracks. Throughout the 1980s, the Soviet Union ran massive budget deficits to maintain its empire, military spending to match American buildup, subsidies to keep satellite states loyal, a bloated bureaucracy that employed millions in unproductive work. Instead of producing value, they printed rubles, and they relied on one thing to backstop the entire system: oil exports. In 1985, crude oil traded at $30 per barrel. Soviet hard currency earnings depended almost entirely on selling energy to the West. Then came 1986. Oil prices collapsed below $10 per barrel, a 70% drop in less than a year. Soviet hard currency earnings fell 40% in 2 years. Suddenly, the ruble's implied value, which was backed by energy exports, evaporated. But the government kept printing. They had no choice. Stopping the printing press meant immediate bankruptcy. Continuing meant slow disintegration. They chose disintegration. Here is what most people do not understand about what happened next. The Soviet Union did not collapse in 1991 when it formally dissolved. It died in 1988. Internal Soviet documents from that year show senior officials knew the ruble was doomed. They saw the same pattern that destroyed Weimar Germany playing out in real time: debt, printing, collapsing confidence. But they were trapped. Every option led to the same destination. The only question was how fast they would get there. By 1990, the gap between reality and official fiction became absurd. The state said $1 equaled 0.6 rubles. Now, that was the official exchange rate, the one printed in newspapers, the one used for government accounting. The street said $1 bought 20 rubles. That was what people actually paid when they needed hard currency, a 30-to-1 gap between what the government claimed and what citizens experienced. Everyone knew their government was lying about the value of their own money. And once a population stops believing in the currency, they stop believing in everything the currency represents. Hyperinflation followed the collapse. In 1992, prices rose 2,520%. Not over a decade, in 1 year. A lifetime of savings could not buy a month of groceries. Pensions became worthless. The social contract between government and citizen, the basic promise that working and saving would provide security, shattered completely. Here's the part that should keep American policymakers awake at night. The Soviet collapse was not gradual. Once the currency lost credibility, the political system followed within months. 1 year, they were a superpower with nuclear weapons, a space program, and military bases across the globe. The next year, they did not exist. The map of the world had to be redrawn. The human cost was staggering. Oligarchs emerged from the chaos, buying state assets for pennies on the dollar. A factory worth $100 million would sell for $2 million to someone with connections and hard currency. Mass poverty spread across former Soviet territories. The middle class evaporated. Alcoholism and suicide rates spiked. Life expectancy for Russian men fell from 69 years in 1990 to 57 years by 1994. 12 years of life gone in 4 years. The population began shrinking. Russia entered a demographic collapse it still has not fully recovered from. And here's the detail that connects 1991 directly to today. Vladimir Putin lived through this. He was a mid-level KGB officer in East Germany when the Berlin Wall fell. He returned to a country coming apart at the seams. He watched a currency collapse destroy a superpower from the inside. That experience did not just shape his worldview, it shaped Russian foreign policy for the next 3 decades. When Putin pushes for de-dollarization, he is not following an economic theory. He is acting on personal trauma. He watched what happens when your currency fails and foreign powers control the financial system you depend on. The 99.1% of Russia-China trade now settling in rubles, and UN is not about economics. It is about never being vulnerable to that kind of collapse again. The BRICS payment systems, the gold accumulation, the bilateral currency agreements spreading across the global south. All of it traces back to a generation of leaders who watched reserve currency failure destroy nations in real time. They are building lifeboats because they remember what drowning looks like. 3 examples, 3 different eras, 3 different political systems, 1 identical pattern. Now let me show you exactly where America sits on this timeline right now. You just saw what happened to Weimar Germany, to the British Empire, to the Soviet Union. Now look at America. As of December 2025, total gross national debt stands at $38.4 trillion. That number is so large, it loses meaning. So let me break it down. $112,181 for every man, woman, and child in the country. $284,940 for every household. You did not vote for that debt, but you owe it. And it grows every second you watch this video. The Joint Economic Committee tracks the rate. Over the past year, debt increased by an average of $6.12 billion per day. That works out to $255 million per hour, $4.25 million per minute, 70 hours, $243 per second. In the time it takes you to read this sentence, America added another $250,000 to the pile. At this trajectory, the debt will cross $39 trillion by March 2026, another $1 trillion in roughly 157 days. But here is where the pattern from history starts repeating. In fiscal year 2025, interest payments on the national debt crossed $1 trillion for the first time. Not principal, interest. America is not paying down its credit card. It is barely covering the minimum payment. And that minimum payment just hit $1 trillion. 5 years ago, in fiscal year 2020, net interest costs totaled $345 billion. Today, nearly 3 times that. In 5 years, interest payments have almost tripled while the underlying problems got worse. Interest is now the second largest line item in the federal budget. Only Social Security costs more. Think about what that means. Interest payments have already passed Medicare, already passed Medicaid, already passed the entire Department of Defense budget. You now pay more to service past borrowing than to fund the military that protects the country, and it gets worse. The Congressional Budget Office published projections in January 2025. Under current law, they expect interest costs to reach $1.8 trillion annually by 2035. At that point, net interest will consume roughly 22% of all federal revenue. Nearly 1 in every 4 tax dollars you pay will go directly to bondholders. Not teachers, not infrastructure, not veterans. Bondholders. Many of those bondholders are foreign governments. The same governments building payment systems to bypass the dollar. Let me put the debt to GDP ratio in perspective. At the end of fiscal year 2025, debt held by the public equaled 100% of GDP. The government owes as much as the entire economy produces in a year. The CBO projects this ratio will hit 118% by 2035. That would surpass the previous record of 106% set in 1946 at the end of World War II. But we are not fighting a world war. We are running these deficits during peacetime. During economic growth, by 2055, the CBO projects debt reaching 156% of GDP under current law. If temporary tax provisions are extended, which both parties support, debt could reach 220% of GDP. At that level, interest payments alone could consume 30 to 40% of all federal revenue. Now, here's what happened while the debt clock kept ticking. In July 2025, Congress passed the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. The CBO scored it at $4.1 trillion in added debt over 10 years. That is larger than the pandemic relief bills, larger than any single piece of legislation in decades. $5.9 trillion in costs, $2.5 trillion in offsets, a $4.1 trillion gap added to an already unsustainable trajectory. The fiscal year 2025 deficit came in at $1.8 trillion, not during a recession, not during a war, during what economists call normal economic conditions. America is running nearly $2 trillion annual deficits as business as usual. Here is what history teaches us about these numbers. Weimar Germany's debt to GDP ratio in 1920 was around 60%. Experts called it manageable. 3 years later, hyperinflation destroyed the economy. Britain's debt to GDP ratio in 1945 was 270%. They maintained reserve currency status for 2 more decades on pure inertia. Then it collapsed over 5 weeks in 1947 when confidence cracked. The Soviet Union's fiscal position looked stable on paper until oil prices collapsed. Within 6 years, the country ceased to exist. Every reserve currency collapse began with debt that seemed manageable until suddenly it was not. Interest costs that seemed sustainable until they exploded. The Congressional Budget Office projections assume average interest rates stay around 3.4%. If rates rise to historical averages above 5%, the math becomes catastrophic. Historical data shows that once debt exceeds 150% of GDP, it becomes nearly impossible to stabilize without one of 3 options: dramatic austerity, severe inflation, or default. There is no fourth option. And every empire facing this choice has chosen inflation, because austerity means political suicide. Default means immediate collapse. Inflation is slow enough to blame on external factors. Slow enough that by the time people realize what happened, the wealth transfer is complete. Now let me show you what the rivals are building while America debates whether there is even a problem. While Washington debates debt ceilings and passes trillion-dollar spending bills, rival powers are building the pipes to survive what comes next. They are not trying to destroy the dollar overnight. They are building lifeboats before the ship sinks. Start with the payment systems. China's cross-border interbank payment system now connects 1,538 financial institutions across 127 countries. SWIFT still dwarfs it with over 11,000 connected banks. But CIPS does not need to be bigger. It needs to be functional enough that sanctions become survivable. Russia proved the concept works. After getting cut from SWIFT in 2022, Russia linked its SPFS messaging system with Chinese infrastructure. Trade kept flowing. The economy did not collapse as predicted. Now they are scaling it. At the 2024 BRICS summit in Kazan, leaders announced the BRICS Bridge payment platform. The goal is handling 30% of intra-BRICS trade by 2027. That is not a replacement for the dollar system. That is a parallel system for half the world's population. In July 2025, Egyptian Prime Minister Mostafa Madbouli confirmed BRICS members are officially adopting local currency settlements as policy, not as experiment, as policy. Then there's the gold. Central banks bought over 1,000 metric tons of gold in 2022, 2023, and 2024. 3 consecutive years above that threshold. That is double the purchasing rate of the previous decade. From 2022 to 2024, total central bank gold purchases hit 3,220 metric tons. In the first half of 2025 alone, Poland added 67.2 tons. Azerbaijan added 34.5 tons. Kazakhstan added 22.1 tons. 23 countries increased reserves in 6 months. The World Gold Council surveyed 73 central banks in 2025. The results should alarm anyone paying attention. 95% expect global gold reserves to increase over the next 12 months. 43% plan to grow their own holdings. 0 central banks expect their gold reserves to decline. None. When asked why, central bankers cited 3 factors: inflation hedge, crisis performance, and geopolitical diversification. That third reason is the one that matters. Geopolitical diversification means assets outside the reach of Western sanctions. Assets that cannot be frozen with a phone call. Gold does not care about SWIFT access. Gold does not care about Treasury Department designations. Gold sits in a vault and holds value regardless of which payment network you can access. This is not speculation about what might happen. This is documented preparation for what central banks believe will happen. The dollar is not dying tomorrow, but the infrastructure for a post-dollar world is being built today, pipe by pipe, agreement by agreement, gold bar by gold bar. And America is not building anything. America is adding $70,843 to its debt every second while pretending the competition does not exist. Now I can hear the objections forming. Let me address them directly. Objection 1. The dollar is backed by the strongest military in history. Military power guarantees currency dominance. This is the most dangerous myth in American thinking right now. Yes, America has the strongest military on earth. You know who else had dominant militaries when their currencies collapsed? The British Empire, the Soviet Union, Rome. Military power can force short-term compliance. It cannot force long-term trust. And reserve currency status requires trust. Here's the proof. In February 2022, the US and Europe froze $300 billion in Russian foreign reserves. The goal was to punish Russia and collapse its economy within weeks. The actual result? Every non-Western country asked one question. Could they do this to us? Saudi Arabia watched and started accepting yuan for oil. The first yuan-denominated oil transaction happened in March 2022, 1 month after Russian sanctions. India started negotiating rupee trade deals with over 20 countries before that year ended. You cannot bomb people into trusting your currency. The moment you weaponize money for geopolitical goals, you undermine the trust that makes it valuable. Objection 2. The alternatives are not ready. BRICS cannot replace the dollar. You are right. They cannot replace it today. But that is not the strategy. The strategy is building sufficient infrastructure so that when the dollar falters, there is somewhere for capital to go. You do not wait until your house is burning to install smoke detectors. You install them while everything seems fine. CIPS does not need to match SWIFT's size. It needs to process enough volume that getting cut from SWIFT is not a death sentence. At 1,138 institutions across 127 countries, it has already crossed that threshold. The BRICS Bridge payment system is designed to handle 30% of intra-BRICS trade by 2027. That is not world domination. That is a functional lifeboat for half the global population. By the time you realize they have succeeded, it will be too late to respond. Objection 3. America is too big to fail. The global economy depends on dollar stability. This is partially true, and that is exactly the problem. Global stability currently depends on American fiscal discipline, Look at the numbers and tell me you see fiscal discipline. $38.4 trillion in debt, $1 trillion in annual interest payments, $1.8 trillion deficits during peacetime. Too big to fail is not economic analysis. It is wishful thinking disguised as inevitability. The Weimar Republic was the fourth largest economy in 1920. Too big to fail. By 1923, it had failed. The Soviet Union was a nuclear superpower with the second largest economy in 1985. Too big to fail. By 1991, it did not exist. The very fact that the global economy depends on the dollar is exactly why rivals are motivated to end that dependence. No rational country wants its economic fate tied to American political dysfunction and $70, 843 per second debt accumulation. The dollar's centrality is not strength. It is a vulnerability that rivals are systematically exploiting. Based on Congressional Budget Office projections, IMF reserve data, and current de-dollarization trends, here is the most likely timeline. 2025 to 2027. Continued erosion. BRICS payment systems expand. Dollar share of global reserves drops below 55%. Interest payments consume growing share of federal budget. 2027 to 2030. Acceleration. Debt to GDP exceeds 120%. Interest becomes the single largest federal expense. More countries join bilateral currency agreements. 2030 to 2035. Critical window. If current trajectories hold, debt dynamics force a choice. Default, severe austerity, or accepting rapid inflation to erode debt value. Here are the 5 metrics to watch. 1. U.S. debt to GDP ratio. If it crosses 130% before 2030, the timeline accelerates. 2. Dollar share of global reserves. The IMF publishes this quarterly. Below 50% is a psychological threshold. 3. CAP's transaction volume. Currently around $80 billion daily. If it crosses $200 billion, major economies can function outside the dollar system. 4. Central bank gold purchases. The World Gold Council reports quarterly. Purchases above 1,500 tons annually signal panic hedging. 5. Interest payments as percentage of federal revenue. Currently around 18%. Above 25% means the spiral is accelerating. Every reserve currency transition follows the same psychological arc. First, denial. Too big to fail. Second, elite recognition. Central banks quietly diversify while public discourse stays optimistic. Third, mainstream awareness. Media starts discussing possibilities. Fourth, panic. Capital flight beyond control. We are between stage 2 and stage 3 right now. Central banks are diversifying. Gold purchases are at record levels. Payment alternatives are operational. The question is not whether this transition happens. The question is whether you see it coming before your purchasing power disappears.